I am going to give you a few little teaching tips on how to help your students develop understandings around academic language. Helping your students learn academic language can be a little tricky. It does require a certain amount of patience and consistency. There are lots of things that you can do to help develop it, but I'm going to share with you things that I think my three favorite things. All right. But first of all, when we say academic language, what are we talking about? We're talking about the oral and written demands students need to successfully read, write, and communicate in school. It's going to be specialized terms. It's going to be different ways of ordering sentences, right? It's going to be grammatical structures. It's going to be syntactical structures. It's going to be the purposes for which they are communicating. And it's going to look, in some cases, for some students, like a whole different way of speaking and listening and communicating. So academic language is about learning how to read the way that we write academically, but it's also for students learning how to write and communicate, right, and speak in academic ways. So I'm going to talk to you about three techniques that you can use to support academic language development. They are modeling academic language, rephrasing students' responses, and co-shaping conversations. So for the first one here, modeling academic language. The idea here is, right, you are a model for how academic language should look, okay, and how we speak it and how we communicate it. One way to do this is to use sentence starters as guides. And so you'll see over here to the right, I have an example of a sentence starter. Although for some reason it didn't quite show up exactly, so I'm just a little off the screen here, I apologize, but I'll read it. So an example could be, and I wrote this in a very generic way so that it would be specific to any book, and this is an English language arts sentence starter example. So what does the character in the book do to resolve the conflict? She works to resolve the conflict by, all right, so you're asking a question. What does the character in the book do to resolve the conflict? Instead of just stopping there, you give them a starter, a sentence starter to get them going. She works to resolve the conflict by. You've got in there conflict, which is an important word, and resolve, right? Because it's typically what the characters are trying to do, okay? And you can replace, obviously, character with a specific character, book, or chapter with, specific titles. But that helps set up the tone and some of the language that you want students to use when they talk about, right? When they talk about the character and conflict and resolution. And if they don't use that language, you can always bring them back to the sentence starter and remind them of those key terms. The other thing is setting the pace. Decide what it is that you're going to discuss here, right? So in the sentence starter example, I've set the tone. We're going to talk about a particular character in a particular book, and we're going to talk about the conflict and specifically how the character tried to resolve that conflict, okay? So I'm setting the tone for what we're going to discuss, and also I'm going to set the tone for how long we're going to discuss it. I'm going to show you some examples in a slide or two where you'll see not that you want to do this every time, but sometimes you have to really go slow and spend a lot of time working on language and sentence structure and vocabulary so that students start to learn how it is that they need to sound, okay? And then you can repeat keywords, repeat key phrases, repeat key sentence patterns, okay? It's not necessarily that you're explicitly breaking it down, but it's just that you're using this language, okay? And so you might, like in a discussion about characters and conflicts, I might constantly use, like if it's a main character, I might constantly say our main character, resolve the conflict. Here's what she did when she was faced with the conflict. Here's what happened when she couldn't resolve the conflict right away. I might keep using these words, resolve and conflict, in different ways as we have the discussion, as students say things, right? I might rephrase it back to them, okay? All right, so that gets us to the next point, right? Rephrasing students' responses. So on the one hand, students aren't going to know how it is that they should sound in terms of communicating academically, and that's okay. That's part of what school is for. If they do an incorrect response, excuse me, the other thing that you can do for rephrasing is correct it by rephrasing it. Rephrasing also allows you to upgrade the vocabulary, upgrade the sentence structure, give them a different model, okay, for how it can look. So in this example, the teacher says, what was the text about? And the student says, oh, people who study rocks. That's not an incorrect response in this example. But what we want to do, what you see in line 3, is the teacher wants them to talk about geologists, not just these people who study rocks. So the teacher says, yes, how geologists, let's use the word geologist because that's the term, study rocks. So you could do this a couple ways. You could say, yes, we're talking about how geologists study rocks, but you can see in there the teacher's embedded a definition, sort of, right? The student gave the definition, people who study rocks. It's an incomplete definition, but it's a start. Let's use the word geologist because that's the term. That kind of talk is helpful for everyone. It's also going to be very helpful for English language learners because I've said we're going to use this fancy word geologist, and now I've given them we have somewhat of a definition on the table here for what a geologist is. Okay, and so now the teacher says, so, all right, how geologists study rocks to do what? And the student says, learn about them. Well, that's fair. That's not incorrect, but it's a very generic response. And so the teacher asks, what are they trying to learn? And the student, because the student probably thinks like, what's wrong with you? This is a dumb question, right? They're trying to learn about the rocks, okay? And so then the teacher says, well, let's try this. How geologists collect data on rocks to study the Earth's history. So all this teacher is doing there is rephrasing the student's responses, right? Keeps working with this particular student to get at something that's worded in a much more academic nature, okay? And so you can see here that this would be, it's a great deal of time to answer the question, what was the text about? And it's not that you want to do this every single time. This is just something that you can do. And it's a little difficult to do at first, but once you get in the mindset of doing it, it will become second nature and you'll start doing it a lot quicker. But you don't always want to break something down this fine grain, but it is something that you want to do every once in a while. All right, and then finally, this idea of co-shaping conversations. This is going to help make conversations more academic. So it's the idea that, you're having a discussion. It could be with one student, small group, whole class, whatever. The example here is just so that I give you as a one-on-one. And it's the idea that you are working with them to shape the direction of the conversation and provide a little more academic language to the context. So the teacher says, what are you working on? And the student says, I'm making a thing to show how many people died a long time ago. That's not terribly specific and it doesn't use any academic language, right? I'm making a thing. What thing? Showed how many people died a long time ago. When is that? So the teacher says, you're making a graph to show how many people died during the bubonic plague. All right. So the teacher takes this phrase of I'm making a thing and gives the student language for it. You're making a graph. And then she gives language for, what that graph is about to show how many people died during the bubonic plague. And the student says, yes, and I'm showing all the places they died. And so the teacher's looking at this graph and saying, okay, I see what you're doing here. Teacher says, all right, you're incorporating different bars, right? It's a bar graph. You're incorporating different bars to represent different countries and their death rates. And you could this example could even be a little bit better, right? During the bubonic plague kind of a thing, or during specific years, all right? So, but this gives you an idea of we're still talking about, what the student was saying, this idea of making a thing to show how many people died, but the teacher is helping to shape the conversation. Now, the student may not start taking up any of this language right here, right? The student may keep talking in a generic, non-specific, non-academic kind of way. That's okay. This is another way to model and sort of show how to take their ideas and make them more academic. They will eventually start to take up this language. All right, so final reminders in terms of teaching academic language. This is going to be a new way of communicating and talking, right, and writing for a lot of your students. So almost think of it as a new language in a way. Okay, they're learning different ways to read and write and speak and all of that. So you have to be patient with them. They're not going to pick this up overnight. They're not going to start incorporating this vocabulary overnight. And then you also need to be consistent, right? Which means that if you don't have any of these habits yourself, you need to start to develop them and then be consistent, just using them, peppering them in throughout the day as it makes sense to do so. The more you do it, the more second nature it will get and the easier it will become.